Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is July 18th, 2018. Tonight, Bill C-58. New access to information and privacy laws that really improve neither for Canada or Canadians. Nowhere near groundbreaking, let's put it that way. There were a lot of big promises in that 2015 Liberal campaign, weren't there? Such as electoral reform, such as eliminating the National Energy Board and having new project hearings, such as a new relationship with Indigenous Peoples, such as fixing C-51. See a common theme here? Well, add another one to the growing pile. After promising to renew and replace Canada's 1982 privacy and access to information laws, we get Bill C-58, which amends those 35-year-old laws instead of replacing. Now, why has corporate media ignored this issue so consistently, except for the odd cursory update of its progress on the order paper? I have only the usual suspects of independent media kept it current. We're going to look at what there is to fear for the mainstream press with actual access to information. Well, the Liberals started the consultation for new access to information and privacy laws like they meant business in the spring of 2016. Stakeholders, academics, expert groups, and the Commissioner of Information and the Commissioner of Privacy gave input. Then a funny thing happened. Bill C-58 hit the floor of the House of Commons on first reading and effectively ignored all of that consultation. As Suzanne Legault neared the end of her term as Information Commissioner, she repeatedly called out C-58 as inadequate and regressive. Her replacement, Caroline Maynard, has not changed that position in any real effect. Privacy Commissioner Daniel Therrien has not been a fan of C-58, also using the terms regressive and not helping regarding any current backlogs or deficiencies. So, with time allocation, a wholesale rejection of a lengthy list of committee amendments, and near invisible passage to the Senate is where we are now. Sunny ways, friends. The Senate seems determined to take this bill apart, calling all the same detractors to tell them about its failures in their committee. Will it be sent back to the House with huge amendments? Will the threat of proroguement kill it and many other bills? Although proroguement would not kill it automatically. But would we be better off where C-58 is concerned and start over? Well, you're going to find out where my opinion is on that question. There has been, from independent media, from experts, from NGOs, regular updating on C-58. But if you watch mainstream media, you sure as hell wouldn't be hearing about it. There are a few people in particular I will be citing and accrediting in this episode tonight. We'll go back to where C-58 started with the campaign promise from the Liberals to completely redo Canada's access to information. Then candidate Justin Trudeau called the system broken. The opinions I will share and cite tonight will certainly not give you any confidence that that broken system has in any way been repaired. One of the people who is well known within access to information circles is a gentleman named Ken Rubin. Ken has made a career out of access to information. He is a go-to source for political parties, media outlets, and individuals for navigation and advice and even assistance with access to information. Now, back in April 2016, kenrubin.ca. Just like it sounds. RUIBIN. kenrubin.ca. In April 2016, this consultation process began. Ken Rubin had a submission to that committee, which was a standing committee on access to information, privacy, and ethics, on moving ahead with new transparency legislation. I'd like to quote some from Mr. Rubin's submission to that committee. As I said, he knows how this law doesn't work. Canada needs to embrace transparency legislation that is bold. For too long, Ottawa's antiquated and dysfunctional 1982 Access to Information Act has blocked fuller transparency and encouraged secrecy practices. The right to access should not be hindered by barriers that include lengthy delays, high fees, creative avoidance, and multiple exemptions and exclusions. Governments and information commissioners to date, unfortunately, have sought housekeeping and quick fix changes that do not abandon the culture of secrecy. The best way to move forward is with a comprehensive bill for open government that brings together several transparency measures. That's because better access to government information alone will not bring about transparency or a culture of openness without a combination of measures to create more effective means for greater public disclosure. Central to new law is the creation of proactive disclosure code and transparency agreements with the purpose of guaranteeing information rights, freedom of expression, and freedom to participate. Now, Mr. Rubin saw the key ingredients for this to happen as being a clear purpose clause. The sole purpose of a newly created Right to Know Act is to enhance freedom of expression and maximize disclosure and accountability. This elaborates on an essential part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The existing Access to Information Act emphasis on secrecy goals needs to be dropped. A proactive disclosure code would create a legal mandatory obligation making data on public money, health, safety, environmental, and consumer matters widely available via the internet in a digital machine-readable, usable format on a regular and instantaneous basis. The code would set out the operative principles: right to transparency and broad access, right to proactive service for access, right to wide coverage, right to effective decision record-keeping and retrieval, and a right to independent review. Under this code, proactive disclosure will no longer be limited to a few selective administrative records. Simply belatedly posting on government websites limited information about some senior officials' travel costs is, for example, insufficient. The means to achieve broader disclosure have to include open meeting requirements. Effective public entry to the decision-making meetings of boards and commissions should be required instead of the real business being done behind closed doors. Nothing helps transparency more than involving the public early on and ensuring that public participation and consultations are more than token. A transparency system needs reliable connectivity to the internet where institutional data is transmitted and set out. Effective education is needed about the availability of proactive disclosures. Having an independent parliamentary budget officer provides a fuller picture of financial costs and projections, ensuring that Parliament and the public are better served. In addition, a new parliamentary legislative officer would make public analyses of ever-increasing complex legislative proposals available to Parliament and the public. Now, Mr. Rubin also said that, as he said, it takes a lot of things to make an effective system. The administrative tools an effective disclosure system needs are the duty to document. No transparency and accountability system can survive without up-to-date and immediate retrieval of information, as well as a responsive management and effective information management system. What needs to be preserved and documented are decisions and their background, day-to-day operations, and matters of significant public interest. The duty to investigate. There needs to be a triggering mechanism that allows public inquiries to be initiated to gather and uncover affairs of significant public interest. These include matters of food safety, climate change, Aboriginal rights and disparities, healthcare, corporate waste, and government waste. Just as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought out information on residential schools and various inquiries sought out data and reported, Canada's Transparency Act would have an embedded public inquiry mechanism that gets at the truth through investigation, documentation, and public reporting. Mr. Rubin goes on, in order for transparency to grow and thrive, further oversight, assistance, and protection are needed, including permanent parliamentary oversight, intervention assistance. Those members of the public with fewer resources need to have the same means and support to challenge secrecy practices. Protection of an accessible, open, and neutral internet and telecommunications, and of an independent media. This is a very interesting part of Mr. Rubin's submission. He flat out, in his opinion, confirms that independent media and a free internet are crucial to access to information. He also called for whistleblowing protection. And as I said, Mr. Rubin has been dealing with these departments for decades. He knows of what he speaks. A basic change in attitude and political will is required that places information rights, freedom of expression, and freedom to participate as paramount. What is not wanted is more default and delay systems, codes for silent conduct, and superficial chat dialogues. There should be no confusion with open data sets as the equivalent of giving Canadians the right to know how its government operates. What legislators 34 years later need to address in a nonpartisan way is that disclosure becomes the norm and is no longer a consolation prize secondary to the many entrenched secrecy claims of special interests. Starting with cabinet and senior officials, their privileges can no longer be sacrosanct and closed off confidences. Canadians need more than access to public records. They need mechanisms to finally create a public disclosure atmosphere that rejects fear, avoidance, deception, and secrecy. Well, I'd say that's pretty straightforward about where the issues lie. That was in April. In the first week of May 2016, Scott Bryson came forward with what Bill C-58 would look like. On May 18th in the Hill Times, Ken Rubin gave a little reflection on that. The byline of the article is Smoke and Mirrors, Phase 1 of the Fed's glib transparency moves. In this article, Mr. Rubin will counter how the law was first presented. There was noise made about fee reduction. The news headlines highlighted that the government would reduce access to information request fees. That may look wonderful on the surface, but in reality, the government kept the only fee that they now can collect, the $5 application fee. The federal court has already ruled that most fees connected to electronic record search and preparation could no longer be collected. Keeping the $5 fee acts as a deterrent to use, but it remains. Secrecy software development. Those millions of dollars in the budget 2016 are also not primarily going to include an online system, so users can, in machine-readable form, fully read most government records. The prime costs are going towards creating new software that allows the government to eliminate much data under the current secrecy exemptions that the government has not changed. Further restricted transparency means expensive secrecy software upgrades. Electronic retrieval is in crisis. The Government Shared Services Agency, which has been criticized by the Auditor General for sloppy and late electronic upgrades, gets $383 million in budget 2016. But don't expect this money to go to immediately fixing the growing internal problems with electronic record retrieval or make the system upgrades more user-friendly. A spreadsheet government concept. One heralded example used by Treasury Board for machine-readable electronic access was that the public would finally get financial spreadsheets online. But as the Parliamentary Budget Office indicates, these data spreadsheets may be incomplete in regards to the true state of Canada's public accounts and not delivered quickly or with explanations. The new open government directives. The May 5th Treasury Board directive that Verizon promoted as stressing greater core openness hardly is a ringing endorsement for every public employee releasing records, ending a culture of secrecy. The directive indicates there is no obligation to explain records. Employees are directed to applying the 4 categories of the numerous listed security and secrecy exemptions where necessary. Less time and specifics are provided on which specific proactive disclosure practices should be adopted or how they will work. New exclusions. Most worrisome was Bryson's testimony at committee, where he repeatedly noted the need for exclusions of certain records from Access Act coverage. He named those exclusion areas as security, personal information, and sensitive monetary data. Adding further lines of secrecy via exclusions would be a step backwards. Bryson even indicated there could be some categories of data, such as on security matters, including in-cabinet records, that even the Information Commissioner could not have access to or review. Right now, the security exemption is not a mandatory one and has no outright exclusions. So this is, in fact, a plain, visible step backwards. Information by default. The big Trudeau government PR selling point is that it will give public information only by default, but not fully and not as a right. Reversing the presumption that information is secret just is not on their agenda. There is a new D word to be added to the list, which now makes 4 Ds: delay, deceit, denial, and default. So, Mr. Rubin, not a fan. On June 19, 2017, Bill C-58 was tabled in the House of Commons by Treasury Board President Scott Bryson. I'm just going to read out the aims of this piece of legislation. And notice the sunny ways language. And keep that in mind as we look at what this bill actually is. Now again, this is not creating a new act, a new law. C-58 is merely amending the 1982 Access to Information Act. So, this enactment amends the Access to Information Act to, among other things, authorize the head of a government institution with the approval of the Information Commissioner to decline to act on a request for access to a record for various reasons. Authorize the Information Commissioner to refuse to investigate or cease to investigate a complaint that is, in the Commissioner's opinion, trivial, frivolous, vexatious, or made in bad faith. Authorize the Information Commissioner to make orders for the release of records or with respect to other matters relating to requesting or obtaining records, and to publish any reports that he or she makes, including those that contain any orders he or she makes, and give parties the right to apply to the federal court for a review of the matter. Create a new part of the Act providing for the proactive publication of information or materials related to the Senate, the House of Commons, parliamentary entities, ministers' offices, government institutions, and institutions that support superior courts. Authorize government institutions to provide to other government institutions services related to requests for access to records. It also amends the Privacy Act to, among other things, create a new exception to the definition of personal information with respect to certain information regarding an individual who is a ministerial advisor or a member of the ministerial staff. You can decipher that. Everybody can. That's a new roadblock. Expand the Governor in Council's power to amend the schedule to the Act and to retroactively validate amendments to that schedule. Guess who that is? That's Cabinet. That's the Prime Minister. So, as we saw repeatedly with orders in council of the Harper government, awful lot of things get decided without even being mentioned in public. Sunny ways, my friends. The day after, on June 20th, Michael Geist, professor at the University of Ottawa, had his comments. Why the government's ATI reform bill is a promise broken. Proactive disclosure does not equal access to information. The government introduced Bill C-58 yesterday. The bill promoted as fulfilling its commitment on access to information reform. Discouragingly, it fails to do so. The bill does include some notable improvements, including implementing order-making power for the Information Commissioner and establishing a requirement to justify with written reasons why information is redacted. However, the bill does not live up to the campaign promise, nor does it fully address long-standing concerns with the law. An open government plan that only addresses the information that government wants to make available, rather than all of the information to which the public is entitled, is not an open plan. That was said by Michael Geist in 2014, when the Conservatives made similar promises and did nothing. Bill C-58 seeks to conflate access to information with proactive disclosure, treating the information the government wants to make available as the equivalent to the information to which the public is entitled and may want to access. The decision to embed proactive disclosure within the title of the Act itself and treat it as an equivalent part of the access to information system represents a dangerous watering down of the legislation and opens the door to shifting more and more information toward government determining what the public is able to see, rather than responding to public requests for information. The problems with the bill do not end there. It creates the prospect of refusing to respond to requests that are considered vexatious or in bad faith. And it resurfaces the possibility of bringing back user fees beyond the $5 application fee. The bill also fails to pick up on several key recommendations that have surfaced over the years. It does nothing to address overbroad exceptions that often result in redacted information, blank pages throughout the request, or lengthy delays. It also does not adopt one of the committee's most important recommendations, a general public interest override. The general public interest override can cut both ways, sometimes leading to more disclosure, sometimes less. However, many access to information laws include the analysis to ensure that the public interest is factored into the decision determining what information is released. This law does not do so. Mr. Geist, not impressed. First reading of the bill was June 19th, 2017. Well, excuse me for 1 second. I'm just really, not good at multitasking most of the time. First reading of C-58 was on June 19, 2017. Ken Rubin, Hill Times, June 26, 2017. What started as an election open government pledge in the fall of 2015 now appears in mid-2017 as Bill C-58. It took 3 cabinet ministers last week, Treasury Board President Scott Bryson, Democratic Institutions Minister Karina Gould, and Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould to announce so very little. The main expected change to cover some ministers' and prime ministers' records under the access legislation was abandoned, given ministers' offices and the PMO's resistance. Instead, Bryson tried to spin how great it would be that some mundane briefing lists, mandate letters, and ministers' expenses would become legally available as part of a take-it-or-leave-it government publication scheme. The central amendment that did materialize calls for giving the Information Commissioner binding order review powers, with the burden of proof on the government to defend its secrecy practices. But the Commissioner's newly acquired order-making powers would be largely crippled and counterproductive because no amendments were put forward to change the numerous broad exemptions in the Access to Information Act that cut off access to many government records. Without changing the top-down, broadly applied policy advice and cabinet confidentiality regime, the amendments proposed do little to help the Commissioner set meaningful precedents or change Ottawa secrecy. The Commissioner will remain unable to review cabinet confidences. The Commissioner, under the Bill C-58 amendments, must also give corporate third parties special rights to be consulted before issuing orders. These orders can and will, in many cases, be challenged in federal court by the government and corporations and possibly overturned. What also makes a mockery of C-58 order-making initiative is that the Trudeau government has put forward other legislation that makes certain records off limits to the Commissioner, the court's review, or their ability to order releases. This is a very important point that I'm going to break here, that Mr. Rubin has been on for a long time, and you will never hear anything about this in corporate media. Bill C-22 gives the new National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, Government Secretariat, and Departments power to unilaterally decide what is to be considered security-excluded data without independent review. The bill also greatly enhances the Prime Minister's power to decide what security data is documented and released to this committee, which he controls. Now that's worth expanding on. Bill C-22, which is now law in CIRA. If you remember, all members to be nominated, the parliamentarians to be nominated to the National Security Review Committee, will have to pass vetting, pass a security clearance, take an oath of lifelong confidentiality. The committee will be answerable to the Prime Minister, not to Parliament. And at this point in time, it will have a safe majority of Liberals. So under those conditions, since C-22 is now law and is getting started up within CIRA, with Bill C-58, there's going to be less access than there is now. Sunny ways, the omnibus budget legislation, Bill C-44, contains a section devoted to setting up the Canada Infrastructure Bank that in Section 28, gives the government power to decide unilaterally what is privileged information based on commercial infrastructure, financial, and political transactions, with no independent review. It is already a controversial enough bill with its provisions that grant Ottawa political direction power in the bank's operation. Slush fund. The budget bill also contains separate provisions that allow the key House of Commons Internal Economy Committee to continue to meet on many issues behind closed doors with no independent recourse to independent review. Keeping the BIE secret certainly doesn't sound familiar from the Sunny Ways campaign. I don't know about you. I don't recall hearing that. So under Trudeau's Bill C-22 and C-44, new security and commercial data exclusions are put in place that override access legislation. And one amendment in Bill C-58 also directly increases secrecy by expanding and broadening the legal definition of what is able to be exempt under solicitor-client relations. Public access is not well served, either by the government amendment in Bill C-58, giving themselves the mandatory right to refuse to process some requests because they are too complex, hard to answer, too frivolous, or submitted in what the government decides is bad faith. The Commissioner can then endorse or reject the government decision of who are targeted unfit access requesters, and also exclude hearing from complainants who are difficult and vexatious. Such anti-access provisions contradict having a duty to assist requesters and being open to giving more opportunities to releasing more information. It is not at all a system that instantaneously and legally makes needed data on health, safety, consumer, and environmental conditions, as well as government operations, automatically public. It is far from the legitimate proactive disclosure system needed. It offers no legal recourse when there are delays in getting information and rejects making order binding appeals possible on the type and quality of information the government provides. Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault, in her final annual report, shared numerous examples of government efforts at refusing information and of poor service that the amendments do little to change. Dean Beebe of the CBC recently discovered that Trudeau's Privy Council Office officials were to be added to those gagged for life from revealing classified information. That form of silencing officials does not change with C-58. Dave Seglins of CBC recently reported on how the government is hoarding secret archives of data on Canada's past actions. That does not change either with C-58. The problem is the government's actual secrecy agenda and legislative actions have crushed any anticipated hope that more sunshine and less roadblocks are coming to Ottawa after a 35-year wait for better transparency. And most important, real proactive, timely disclosure and service with a duty to document with a public interest override provision, fewer and narrower exemptions, and an independent commissioner with binding enforceable order powers, not limited in what can be reviewed. Those are the mainstays that are needed for a long overdue second-generation transparency bill to succeed. The proposed C-58 amendments are weak and not a formula for rebooting Ottawa's penchant for secrecy. What we have is a government frivolous and deviously intent on sweet-talking and subverting transparency. Well, I think that's pretty worded for the layman. Sorry, just taking a little liquid intake there. The C-58 became more public, and all these organizations that had spent their spring and summer testifying to committee, thinking that there would be some advancement coming out of this sunny ways government, were imaginably none too happy when C-58 came down. I think I have reflected Mr. Rubin's frustrations to this point in time. In late September 2017, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, CJFE, released a campaign against C-58. Oh, I'm having a little trouble here. Oh no, that's fine. This is an open letter. It was sent to Scott Bryson. We are writing to you as Canadian and international organizations and individuals who are committed to ensuring a strong access to information system in Canada. The Access to Information Act, now nearly 35 years old, is in desperate need of major reforms to reduce delays and provide for an effective right to access information held by public authorities. This challenge calls for bold and thorough reforms to the Access to Information Act to align it with international standards and better practice in other countries. Unfortunately, the government's proposed reform, Bill C-58, comprehensively fails to meet this challenge. Indeed, this long-awaited bill fails to address a number of serious problems in the Act, including the vastly overbroad regime of exceptions, the broad discretion of public authorities to delay in responding to requests, the absence of any duty for public authorities to document important decision-making processes, and a limited scope of coverage of the Act. In some areas, it even weakens the current rules. Canada is ranked a miserable 49th out of 111 countries on the RTI rating, a global methodology for assessing the strength of a country's legal framework for the right to information, RTI. Bill C-58 would only lift Canada 3 positions to 46th, according to an analysis by the Centre for Law and Democracy. We can and must do better. A healthy and effective access to information system is critical to free expression, public participation, and holding government to account. By introducing legislation of such inadequacy, the government is failing these basic values. We call for Bill C-58 to be scrapped and for government officials to be tasked with crafting a bill that takes seriously the crisis undermining our right to know. The resulting bill must, at bare minimum, include the following changes. Deliver on the promise to expand the scope of the Act to cover the Office of the Prime Minister and Ministers' offices by allowing individuals to make requests for information from these bodies as they may do with other public authorities, while retaining the proposed proactive publication obligations. Introduce a formal duty to document for public authorities and require them to preserve records of their decision-making. Put in place a robust system for limiting the discretion of public authorities to extend time limits for responding to requests and to formalize in law the fee waivers contained in the May 2016 interim directive, that would be after a court decision that said that most fees being charged were unconstitutional. As I said at the start, the government made a big deal that, oh, we're just keeping the $5 fee. That's it. But as CJFE states, it is not in the law that the other fees are eliminated. They still exist in the old law. There is simply a directive to no longer charge them. There is no amendment to remove them from the law. Ensure that exceptions and exclusions to the right of access are narrowly defined and subject to both a test of actual harm and a mandatory public interest override. Give the Information Commissioner binding, enforceable order powers over all complaints regarding requests for information. This was one of the few significant reforms included in C-58, and it should be retained. The public has a right to obtain the information they need to participate meaningfully in democratic processes, while also holding Canada's public officials and the members of Parliament accountable. The current system fails to meet minimum standards, and Bill C-58 will not fix it. The government should withdraw Bill C-58 and present Canadians with a bill that addresses seriously the broken access to information system. Well, who signed on to this letter? Well, I'll just give you some highlights. Amnesty International Canada, British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, British Columbia Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, Canadian Association of Journalists, Canadian Council for International Cooperation, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Canadians for Accountability, Centre for Law and Democracy, Democracy Watch, Committee to Protect Journalists, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, Mining Watch Canada, Open Media, Open North, PEN Canada, Privacy and Access Council of Canada, Reporters Without Borders, the Rideau Institute, the Rocky Mountain Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, CIPIC. These are heavy players in this currency of information. Did it make any changes? Of course not. We have a first past the post majority government. Sunny ways. Carry on. That was in late September. The second reading was in late September, right around the time of that campaign by CJFE. October 9th, 2017, once again, Ken Rubin in the Hill Times. This just in, feds want a more restrictive transparency regime. The House's second reading debate on Bill C-58 in late September 2017 provided opposition parties a chance to vent. But the Liberals appear in no mood to grant any major concessions and seem overconfident that they can, in the next 2 or 3 months, smoothly get Bill C-58 made into the law of the land without significant amendments. It has been left to outgoing Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault in her special report to Parliament to trash, clause by clause, Bill C-58's overtly anti-user and pro-secrecy amendments. For Legault, the crowning indignity was that the Commissioner's role would be brutally emasculated. It was that and declaring users persona non grata for wanting real and full government data that made the bill largely regressive in her analysis. She saw the need for more, not less, checks being placed on Ottawa's bureaucrats' secrecy practices. Legault's analysis pointed out, showing how the proposed commissioner's office was being set up for failure, for the courts and government agencies to make mincemeat of the office's scaled-back powers. Now I'm going to turn to that report put out by the Information Commissioner. It is lengthy. It is detailed. It is very bureaucratic in its language. I'm just going to tell you basically the final score. Now, in a comparative summary in the Commissioner's report, she went through the amendments, which is all C-58 is, remember, amendments to the 1982 Access to Information Act. She listed topic, the current situation, the recommendation of the modernization report, which was from her office back before this massive consultation started, and then the recommendation from the House of Commons Committee. Then she showed what is in Bill C-58, gave a rating of it. Those ratings were positive, neutral, regression, or unknown. And then she offered how to improve it based on that rating. There are 19 categories, sections, clauses, call them what you will, that are in this comparative summary. 19. One of them was found to be neutral. 4 of them were found to be positive. 2 of them were unknown. And 12 of them were labeled by the Commissioner as regressive. Now, for instance, we'll look at the Prime Minister's office and mandate letters. Now, currently, the Prime Minister's office is not subject to this Act. The Commissioner's previous report said that the PMO should be included. The House of Commons Committee said the PMO should be included. Bill C-58 offered the proactive disclosure of mandate letters and revisions to mandate letters. We already have that. The Trudeau government made a huge deal out of making mandate letters public in 2016. And in Bill C-58, the Information Commissioner has no oversight of what is released in proactive materials. It could be what they had to eat and nothing else. And in C-58, the Information Commissioner has to accept that. What was Commissioner Legault's recommendations? Subject the PMO to the right of access under the Act with an exemption for information related to parliamentary functions. Fair enough. Commissioner rated this one neutral because it's not anywhere near what it should be, but it's still more than it currently is. What about ministers' offices? Well, currently they are not covered. The modernization report said cover the ministers' offices under the Act with an exemption for parliamentary functions. The House of Commons Committee said the exact same thing. What does Bill C-58 give us? Proactive disclosure. Requests for proactively disclosed materials can be declined, and the Commissioner has no oversight on those materials. This is rated as a regression by the Commissioner. Her recommendations: subject ministers' offices to the right of access under the Act with an exemption for parliamentary functions. subject ministers' offices to proactively be available to Commissioner oversight. Government institutions, they are not currently covered. The modernization report called for more proactive disclosure obligations for government institutions. The House of Commons Committee agreed. What does Bill C-58 say? Well, it does say more proactive disclosure obligations, but it says requests can be declined and the Commissioner has no oversight. Again, a regression. And you can guess what the suggestions from the Commissioner are. Do what you were recommended to do. Parliament itself. Now, bodies that provide administrative support to Parliament are not covered by the Act. The modernization report said, cover them, with a provision to protect against infringements of parliamentary privilege. The House Commons Committee agreed with that. What does Bill C-58 give us? Proactive disclosure. The Commissioner has no oversight on what that proactive disclosure information is. Regressive, again. And again, the recommendation is quit screwing around and give access. Now, as far as strengthening oversight, the oversight model itself, currently there is an ombudsperson. The Commissioner issues recommendations. That's all, recommendations. The modernization report called for an order-making model. Those orders should be subject to judicial review, and there should be a certification of orders also included. The House of Commons Committee agreed. What does Bill C-58 do? It pretty much stays the way things are now. The Commissioner can issue orders, but they are not certifiable, so they can be ignored. And it provides none of the benefits of a true order-making model. Again, a regression. Currently, if there is an investigation underway, there is no obligation to notify, consult with, or seek representations from the Privacy Commissioner in the course of an investigation. There was no recommendations from the Modernization Report or the House Committee, but Bill C-58 adds two circumstances where the Privacy Commissioner could be implicated, where the institution notifies the Commissioner of an access complaint, or where the Information Commissioner consults the Privacy Commissioner when intending to issue an order when personal information will be disclosed. Again, Commissioner Legault sees this as regression. Remove the notification to and consultation with the Privacy Commissioner. She cites a conflict of interest. Publication of orders. Currently, there are annual and special reports to Parliament. There is strict confidentiality requirements which prevent routine publication of reports of finding. Well, the Modernization Report called for a true order-making model, which would allow for the publication of orders. The House of Commons Committee agreed. Bill C-58, there is no mechanism to publish reports of finding. The purpose of the Act. The purpose of the Act currently is to provide a right of access to all records under the control of institutions. The Act is supposedly facilitates democracy and the right of access has quasi-constitutional status. There were no recommendations to alter that, but Bill C-58 does change it. It amends the purpose of the Act to enhance the accountability and transparency of federal institutions in order to promote an open and democratic society and to enable public debate on the conduct of those institutions. This is a furtherance of its purpose. And the Commissioner calls for a removal of this amendment because it creates ambiguity. Now, the mandatory periodic review. There is no mandatory periodic review currently. The Modernization Report called for a review every 5 years. House Commons Committee called for a review every 5 years. Bill C-58 says the government will review it 1 year after it comes into force, then every 5 years thereafter, with a report tabled to Parliament. There is no timeline to complete the review. So it's not mandatory. Currently, institutions are required to annually publish certain classes of information, which is known as InfoSource. Modernization Report and the House Committee had no recommendations. Bill C-58 removes InfoSource obligations other than the publication of the title and address of the person to whom access requests should be made. This is a regression. Annual reports on the administration of the Access to Information Act. Currently, institutions are required to table an annual report on administration of the Act within 3 months after the end of the fiscal year. Neither committee saw a reason to change that. Bill C-58 extends the time to table a report to any of the first 15 parliamentary sitting days after September 1st. Again, just extending the timeline in case we need it. You know, you never know. So there you go. You've got the outgoing Information Commissioner, who is an officer of Parliament. She, in fact, works for Canada, not the PMO, saying the Bill C-58 is nowhere near what's needed. But yet, as all this is happening on the Hill and so many people are saying that there's big issues here, what did you see on your news about it? Yeah, crickets. I know. Okay, just another liquid pause here. Quick check on Twitter. Give me a break. Okay, got a promotion. Now I'm going to cover the committee testimony summary. Now, this came out on November 4th, 2017 in iPolitics by Beatrice Britneff. The bill set to reform Canada's access to information laws is moving on to clause-by-clause consideration by the Parliamentary Ethics Committee. Unfortunately for the Liberals, critics of Bill C-58 certainly outnumber those who welcome the proposed amendments. Opposition MPs, civil liberties groups, journalists, and the Information Commissioner herself are among the many players dismayed by many of the new provisions. They say the bill falls short of the real reform the Act needs and instead introduces new hurdles to the process Canadians must follow to request government documents. And now I'm going to go over the list of witnesses for this committee hearing. The Treasury Board Secretariat, the Privy Council Office, the Department of Justice, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Democracy Watch, CJFE, represented by the Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom, the Canadian Press, Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia, Canadian Association of Journalists, Evidence for Democracy, Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Canada Border Services Agency, Department of Citizenship and Immigration, Canadian Superior Courts Judges Association, CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, and the Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada. That's a strong lineup. What were the big grievances? Committee phase is where things are supposed to get changed. If something's wrong with a bill, this is where it's supposed to be hammered out and exposed and dealt with. There were quite a few common grievances. Ministers' offices remain off limits. A major sticking point is the fact that the bill does not open up the Prime Minister's office and Cabinet Ministers' offices to access to information requests, which was a promise the Liberals made on the campaign trail 2 years ago. Instead, we have proactive disclosure. While most preface their disapproval by saying they believe in proactive disclosure in principle, critics argued that these new requirements leave the government with control over which documents they choose to circulate and which they choose to keep hidden from the public. Furthermore, they noted the new proactive disclosure regime would not be subject to oversight by the Information Commissioner, and officials who don't follow the rules would not be subject to any fines or sanctions. Kara Zweibel is the Acting General Counsel for the CCLA. Before committee, she said, "This is not a substitute for a strong access regime. This is not the open and transparent government that Canadians want and deserve. And it's not the overhaul of the Access Act that is clearly needed." What has changed since this? Well, Treasury Board President Scott Bryson has indicated, however, that the government is willing to let the Information Commissioner supervise the new proactive disclosure requirements. Big deal. Another part of the bill that has provoked broad outrage is a new provision that gives government departments the power to reject Canadians' access requests if they are not specific enough. Section 6 of Bill C-58 says that requesters must, in their applications to a department, detail the specific subject matter they are looking for and the type of record they want, as well as a clear time frame for when the documents requested were created. This provision has been called unreasonable and is almost universally hated. Heather Schofield, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, told MPs that forcing each and every requester to tick all those boxes is detrimental to the work of reporting on government policy and conduct. This legislation would effectively eliminate many of our more general queries and attempts to find out what is actually going on within government. Only in rare cases do we know with that kind of detail what we are looking for. And even in those cases, we would depend on a leak from within government telling us to look for a certain specific document. Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault speaking before the committee, echoed those comments, insisting that past access requests journalists submitted that blew the lid on major government misconduct, such as the federal sponsorship scandal of the early 2000s, would not have been processed under the new regime. Experts and lawyers representing First Nations groups argued Section 6 will also make it harder for First Nations to acquire documents detailing alleged treaty breaches, and as a result will undermine their work to defend their rights. Another subsection in Bill C-58, raised as a red flag, permits heads of government institutions to refuse a request if they deem it to be vexatious or made in bad faith. Critics, including Legault, say the presence of such a clause is appropriate, but that the bill should be amended further to prevent abuse. Several witnesses insisted department heads should have to ask the Information Commissioner for permission before they deny an access request on those grounds. Schweibel also said the bill should spell out how an institutional head decides what constitutes a frivolous, vexatious, or bad faith request. The Information Commissioner's order-making powers. Now, Ms. Ms. Britneff says, it's no secret Legault is not a fan of C-58. The Access to Information watchdog has gone as far as to call C-58 a regression of existing rights and stated she would much prefer to keep the status quo if the legislation is not amended in a significant manner. Among those recommendations in her report, which I went over quickly, is one that would enhance the Information Commissioner's new power to order a government institution to release documents, which Legault called an ability without teeth. She said the enforcement mechanisms available to the Commissioner if a department or agency does not comply with an order are weak. To address this, she wants C-58 to permit the Commissioner to have an order certified as an order of the federal court. We're seeing a common theme here. But regardless, it passed second reading. Time allocation was passed. All the amendments were rejected, except for the couple window dressing ones, such as Bryson with his consultation with the Commissioner about what proactive disclosure materials are. That's not a big change. That's putting another chair out at a meeting with a script. That's all that is. At the end of the year, passed third reading and went to the Senate. Right before the House break in December, Bill C-58 passed the House with next to no changes. First past the post. Sorry, that's another show. This year, January 10th, 2018, Hill Times, Ken Rubin. The Senate's turn to fix C-58's regressive nature. Last month, the House of Commons Liberal majority got its way, approving the restrictive, anti-transparency Bill C-58. But once the Senate debates the bill in February, expect pushback and amendments to the legislation, updating the Access to Information Act from a reawakened upper chamber. And expect at this time, former Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault, a major critic of C-58, to be around to testify, as her appointment has been extended to the end of February 2018. In any case, senators and the assigned committee will definitely be focusing what amendments to Bill C-58 they can offer to improve a very regressive bill. Senators would do well along the way to reflect on all the government information that they themselves have been denied, and more if Bill C-58 becomes law. Senators who in the past were viewed as the bedrock of conservative and uncritical behavior are getting antsy, especially with a new bloc of independent senators. They are likely more willing to question the direction access to information is taking and hit back. Besides, they will be made aware that many groups and Commissioner Legault have serious problems with Bill C-58, many of whom want the bill entirely withdrawn. Some of the amendments likely to be put forward by senators would delete new restrictions placed on access applicants and on the Information Commissioner. Senators, too, would have room to offer constructive new amendments, like putting into access legislation the often repeated constitutional nature of the public's right to know. Now, Mr. Rubin asked Commissioner Legault, who was still commissioner at this time, a question. Would you find it difficult to work under the conditions Bill C-58 imposes on the commissioner's office? Her response: I have been sounding the alarm on this bill since it was tabled. I remain convinced that it will result in a regression of existing access to information rights. As I have previously stated, it introduces an oversight model where the commissioner is not truly empowered to order the disclosure of information and adds burdensome stages to the investigation process that may lead to delays. It does also not take advantage of any of the benefits of a true order-making model. The conditions it creates will indeed make the work of my office more difficult. Wow, isn't that lovely? But it doesn't stop there. One more second break here. Okay, I see it. Can't respond right now. February 21st, 2018. The Globe and Mail. Yes, the Globe and Mail is featured on the VIP here. Daniel LeBlanc. In her last week in office, Canada's information watchdog is accusing the Liberal government of reneging on its promise to bring a new era of openness to Ottawa and of failing to defend the charter right of Canadians to quick and easy access to federal documents and data. The government is sliding into more secrecy and actually not delivering on its promise. I think it is having a bit of a conflicting reaction with its open government initiative and its proactive disclosure on one side, and on the flip side, the way it is administering access to information in a reactive manner. Disclosure rates are down with this government, surprisingly. Let that sink in. Disclosure rates are down with this government. Ms. Legault was appointed commissioner in 2010. She only has two governments to compare. And disclosure rates are down with this government. In her interview, Commissioner goes on, Bill C-58 is a bill for the bureaucracy. It's definitely not a bill for transparency. The government has made some amendments to the proposed legislation, but it is still regressive in many respects. Sorry. This is not just a right to information. It's part of our charter rights to freedom of expression. If people understood the impact of thwarting that charter right, as we see in other countries, they would be more engaged. Now, it also says here that Ms. Legault would be leaving her position at the end of the month, which is February 2018. The government has announced that she will be replaced by lawyer Caroline Maynard, who is currently the interim chairwoman and CEO of the Military Grievances External Review Committee. And Ms. Maynard would have to appear in front of MPs and senators for basically a confirmation hearing. And that's where we go next, February 28th. In Hill Times, Samantha Wright Allen. Information Commissioner nominee aims to tackle government culture that suppresses information and creates delays. And I didn't highlight anything in this article. Awesome. Awesome. Dumbass. The prospective Access to Information watchdog said this week she will tackle a culture of government in government institutions that denies access to information. But nominee Caroline Maynard resisted calls to criticize a bill her predecessor and opposition parties have slammed for rolling back access rights and failing to deliver on Liberal election promises. She was questioned by the Senate, who sat as a committee of the whole, and then to the House Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics, back-to-back days. She was questioned on her background, her plans for the office, and the office's backlog, thoughts on outgoing Commissioner Legault's criticism of government, and her assessment of Bill C-58. Access delayed is access denied. That being said, success relies on a change in culture towards access rights. There still appears to be an impulse to look for exemptions and exclusions rather than transparency. And Ms. Maynard spoke of her own experience having requests denied and hearing of staff who avoid documentation that might be atypical, ATIP. Atypical. Okay. She said the complaint backlog will be a significant challenge, as well processing new complaints in a shorter time period. By the end of 2016-17 fiscal year, the Information Commissioner's offices had 2,863 open complaints. According to Ms. Legault's special report on Bill C-58 last year, the Treasury Board allocated $3.1 million in extra money to her office to tackle what was then 3,000 complaints. The process of addressing files seems to be slowing, even as the pace of complaints increases, with the office closing 401 fewer complaints in the first 10 months of this fiscal year than in the same time last year. Ms. Maynard said she has heard that under the current system, it takes up to 7 months to assign an investigator to a file and 9 months to deal with it, and that the number of complaints coming in is outpacing the office's ability to deal with files. To me, that is unacceptable, said Ms. Maynard. To address the backlog, Ms. Maynard pointed to her work with the Military Grievances External Review Committee. As interim chairperson of the civilian oversight body, she helped reduce the average time dealing with files from 9 months to 4 months. And since she started there in January 2017, the committee has improved from addressing 40% of complaints to 95% of complaints. Well, that all sounds good, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's been higher percentage of resolution. But hey, it's her job interview. What do you expect? Both senators and members of Parliament in the prospective committees asked if Ms. Maynard could work with the bill, C-58, despite its limitations, and what she thought of her predecessor's assessment. Ms. Maynard was reluctant to criticize the bill's language, telling both committees she doesn't view her role as a legislator with the power to write the country's information laws. That should be left to parliamentarians. Instead, she circled back to her focus on changing culture, noting even the best, most progressive legislation can't solve the problems inherent in the system. If the institutions refuse access or oral documentation instead of written, or they don't document the decisions, you're not going to have better access. She spoke most favorably of the bill and its clear message to hold institutions accountable. Though when pressed by committee members, she agreed some of the language could limit or delay access rights. My goal would be to make sure these exemptions are not being abused. If there's a discretion, it's going to be used reasonably and to apply constant and consistent approach to each institution, and to make sure the decisions are well known. NDP ethics critic Charlie Angus asked Ms. Maynard, do you believe you have the tools to ensure the government doesn't drop the cloak of secrecy? Do you have the power or willingness to stand up for those who are wanting to look into the windows of government? Ms. Maynard replied that she didn't see it as her role to shame the government, but that could be a result of making information public. She shared concerns that Section 6 of C-58 specifically could restrict access because it requires requesters to outline the subject matter, type of record, and date of the record being requested. Independent Senator Murray Sinclair of Manitoba said that is a matter of grave concern to First Nations because they are reliant on government records to proceed with land claims. Under the 1892 Indian Act, band councils were forbidden from having meetings without notifying an Indian agent who took all band records, which still remain in the government's possession. Section 6 could make it more difficult to request those documents. Ms. Maynard replied to that, government has a duty to share these documents. If they're being asked, it would not be appropriate to deny access. I would not hesitate to use powers to investigate and to review that information and to order the disclosure. Well, that's fine. But again, remember, as former Commissioner Legault points out, you can make all the orders you want. Nobody has to listen to them. Needless to say, Ms. Maynard has been appointed Information Commissioner. I will note that much more recently, once she was in the office and was an official officer of Parliament, which meant she was beyond the hook from any partisan activity, she has changed her opinion on C-58. And it is much more in line with what former Commissioner Suzanne Legault had to say. So if she played ball in committee and Senate hearing to get the job, yeah, well, you know, good for her. What are you going to say? At least she's changed her tone now. People will remember from the Harper era, that was one of the bigger issues. They hated this appointment of people that they couldn't axe when they felt like it. That's why they turned their attention to getting cronies. Then it looks better. There's no stink. They're in our pocket. Early indications would indicate that Caroline Maynard, as Information Commissioner of Canada, is not in the government's pocket. We shall see moving forward. Are there partisan activities happening in the Senate to try and get Bill C-58 moved through as unchanged and as quickly as possible? Well, let's discuss that. May 16th this year, in the Hill Times, Samantha Wright Allen. A sweeping 30-year review of the Access to Information Act is stalled in the Senate, raising some concern it won't be passed before Parliament adjourns next month. Since December, New Brunswick Independent Senator Pierrette Ringette, the bill's sponsor and a former Jean Chrétien-era Liberal MP, said there was an agreement to send Bill C-58 to the Senate Banking, Trade and Commerce Committee for study, when all of a sudden the Conservatives said they wanted it to go to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. There's no doubt in my mind that this is a delay tactic from the Conservatives. Adding the Senate's Banking Committee is the better choice because the Legal Committee is wrapped up in several bills, especially one related to drug-impaired driving related to cannabis legislation. And it has almost done its work on the budget bill. If senators really understand their responsibility and their mandate, then we have to move forward. Otherwise, it's political shenanigans that, from my perspective, from the institution of the Senate, is unacceptable. Senator Ringette said she believes the only reason for the change is that Quebec Conservative Senator Claude Carignan is now no longer a member of the Banking Committee, and he's moved to the Legal Affairs Committee. That's pretty selfish in regards to delaying this bill and the ability of Canadians to have greater access to information and greater transparency in the system. Senator Carignan said no such agreement existed, just that there had been discussions that it could go to the Banking Committee. He also rejected the idea that he was a factor, saying many colleagues, including Alberta Independent Senator Elaine McCoy, agreed with his assertion that logically the bill will have to go to legal. We are not there to delay, we are there to do our job properly, said Senator Carignan, adding that it makes no sense to send it to the Banking Committee, whose mandate is to examine legislation and to study issues relating to banking, insurance, trust and loan companies, and credit societies. Senator Ringette, meanwhile, says the Banking Committee has no more connection to the bill than Legal Affairs does. Critics have panned the legislation as regressive, and last week, new Information Commissioner Caroline Maynard added her voice, calling for 3 major amendments. The legislative overhaul gives the Commissioner power to order the release of records, requires review of the Act every 5 years, and creates clauses calling for the proactive disclosure of institutions that are exempt, like the PMO and ministers' offices. New requirements in Section 6 say requesters must outline the subject matter type of record and date of the record, which will limit access and probably even deter people asking for information. Ms. Maynard told the House Ethics Committee on May 8th. That would be in her interview. In a March letter to Treasury Board President Scott Bryson not long after her appointment, Ms. Maynard told the minister responsible for the bill that she shares concerns this section will impose new barriers, and despite not actually yet being a law, has already been invoked by departments to deny requests. Now, just contemplate that. This is something you would expect from a previous government, Harper. This isn't law yet, but yet departments are behaving like it is. The Canadian public hears all these dire warnings about, remember, pot's not legal till October. We're still going to bust you. Double standard much? It would be better to take the time to get the bill right and do it properly, said Ms. Maynard, and address her concerns that push for quick passage. She said she doesn't foresee much impact if the legislation isn't passed by the summer, as her office is still bound by the existing act. If it takes longer, it will just give us more time to get ready for it, because Bill C-58 will add to our operational demand. During her testimony as Information Commissioner candidate, just 3 weeks before she sent the March letter to Minister Bryson, Ms. Maynard was careful in her responses to opposition MPs who asked for her opinion on a bill her predecessor slammed as regressive. But by late March, Ms. Maynard followed up her informal meeting with Mr. Bryson to say the bill likely imposes new barriers, gives her no mechanism to ensure her orders are followed, and it doesn't grant her the oversight power needed until a year after the Act achieves royal assent, effectively putting her office under 3 distinct investigation and complaint systems: the old, the partial under the new Act, and the full power with the new Act a year later. That transition period would create more confusion in the system for all involved. And because most investigations take 9 months to finalize, it is an unnecessary distinction. So there we go. The new Information Commissioner is fulfilling her mandate. It's still in the Senate. It's still stalled. Expect the Senate to make some changes. This is not going to be rubber stamp. It ain't going to happen. And it doesn't deserve to happen. This is a shit law. This is another broken campaign plank. Just like National Energy Board, just like fixing C-51, just like electoral reform, just like the new relationship with Indigenous peoples. There are more. Sunny ways. Now, do you need proof that this system needs fixing? Dean Beebe of the CBC put out a story on May 15th. Information Commissioner finally rules on complaint 10 years later. A legal expert who waited a decade for the Information Commissioner of Canada to rule on his complaint about government secrecy says the parliamentary office should be scrapped because it doesn't work. My take-home lesson from this: the Information Commissioner should be abolished, said Amir Ataran, a law professor at the University of Ottawa. We should get rid of it. I just want it gone. On January 24th, 2008, he filed an official complaint about the withholding of Canadian reports on human rights in 111 countries, which he had asked for through the Access to Information Act, what was then known as DFAIT, Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, identified 968 relevant pages, but withheld key parts, citing 10 sections of the Access to Information Act. The Information Commissioner's Office ended its investigation on May 7th, 2018. 10 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks later, concluding that the complaint was well-founded and resolved. In the interim, over those 10 years, what was then Global Affairs, or is Global Affairs Canada, released 40 additional pages. His original request for the human rights reports was made in mid-2007 when he was publicly questioning the controversial treatment of Afghan detainees by the Canadian military under the government of Stephen Harper. He said the material eventually released is entirely useless now, since the Information Commissioner's investigation stretched through the tenures of 3 commissioners, 3 elections, 1 war mission, and a change in government. Those who request documents through the Access to Information Act are prevented from applying to federal court to assert legal rights until after the Information Commissioner rules on their complaints. Ataran said he prefers the American system, which has no commissioner, but allows aggrieved requesters to go to court as early as 3 weeks after filing a request. What we have here in Canada is government saying that even if you have a legal right to information, we won't respect it. And the commissioner is saying, yeah, that's fine with us. We'd be better off having direct access to court, because the way it works now, the Information Commissioner, in effect, sides with government by protracting investigations. And that is the regime that C-58 seeks to keep in place. There's proof positive that this is a broke system. That is my explanation tonight on C-58. I would suggest anyone who's a little alarmed by this or interested in it to keep track of what the Senate is doing. Now, they're with the cabinet shuffle today, which really doesn't affect this act at all, but what it does affect is the mechanics of government. There is strong probability that Prime Minister Trudeau will ask the Governor General to prorogue Parliament, which would end this session, which is close to 3 years now, which, you know, there have been a lot shorter than that, that's for sure. If Parliament is prorogued, which will allow a new throne speech and basically start the election campaign of 2019, there is a possibility that bills within the system, no matter what stage, could die on the order paper. But that is not a guaranteed possibility. Since 1994, the ability to return bills to their current position on order papers can be used. You know, we're just used to it because Harper used it to kill everything. There is a possibility, even with proroguement, that C-58 will survive. But considering what the Senate is likely to do, if it is heavily amended, if Section 6 is struck from the bill and it's sent back to the House, there's no way it's going to be passed. So I believe it is a possibility that C-58 could be killed on the order paper if there is proroguement. And as we've heard from former Commissioner Legault and Ken Rubin and Michael Geist and other journalists and other groups in committee, what we have now, being 36 years old, is still better than what C-58 proposes. Sunny ways. As I said, that's all on C-58. And as I mentioned, there was a cabinet shuffle today. So guess what next week's show's on? You got it. Let's hope that those goddamn letters, ministerial letters, come out. They may not. We'll see what happens. But that will be next week's show. The cabinet shuffle, getting ready for the election of 2019. That's it for tonight on Bill C-58, access to information and privacy laws that improve neither for Canada. Thank you for listening. Good night.